Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're tackling one of the most monumental and frequently debated questions in all of 20th century history. How did Hitler lose the war? It's a question that, on the surface, seems straightforward, but when you peel back the layers, you uncover a complex web of strategic miscalculations, economic realities, and the sheer resilience of an unexpected global alliance. For many, especially after the breathtaking successes of the Blitzkrieg in the early war years, it almost seemed unfathomable that the Third Reich could be defeated. Hitler's Germany, by 1941, controlled vast swaths of Europe, from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible, the Nazi war machine unstoppable. Yet, with the years, it was all over with Hitler. What happened? Was it a single fatal mistake, a series of errors, or was it an inevitable outcome shaped by factors far beyond any individual's control? Today, we're diving deep into these questions, moving beyond simplistic narratives to explore the nuanced, often brutal, truth behind Germany's defeat. We're going to dissect the critical decisions, the industrial realities, and the geopolitical forces that converge to answer precisely how Hitler loses the war. This isn't just about military campaigns. It's about the systemic flaws and the overwhelming counter-forces that brought the Nazi regime to its knees. To understand this complex tapestry of defeat, I've drawn upon the immense scholarship of some of the most respected historians of World War II. We'll be looking at the economic realities laid bare by Adam Tooze in his seminal work, *The Wages of Destruction*, which meticulously details Germany's economic and industrial limitations. We'll also be heavily relying on Richard Overy's *Why the Allies Won*, a brilliant synthesis that highlights the material and moral superiority of the Allied powers. And, of course, the epic narrative and deep analysis from Antony Beevor's *The Second World War*, which paints a vivid picture of the sheer human cost and strategic blunders across all fronts. While some historical accounts, such as David Irving's *Hitler's War*, focus intensely on Hitler's personal command decisions, often controversially, our focus today will be on integrating a broader spectrum of factors, military, economic, and geopolitical, as illuminated by the consensus of modern scholarship. Many have pondered how Hitler could have won World War II, but our focus today is on the much more crucial, and historically grounded, question of how he did lose. So, buckle up, grab your favorite beverage, and let's embark on this journey into the crucial turning points and underlying causes of one of history's most profound defeats. By the end of this video, you'll have a much clearer understanding of the forces that shaped the outcome of World War II and delivered the definitive answer to how Hitler loses the war. Our journey into understanding how Hitler loses the war must begin, unequivocally, on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was, in Hitler's own words, the crusade against Bolshevism. It was an invasion of unprecedented scale, involving millions of men and thousands of tanks, aimed at swiftly knocking the Soviet Union out of the war within a few months. Initially, the Wehrmacht achieved astonishing successes, encircling vast Soviet armies and advancing hundreds of miles. But this rapid advance harbored the seeds of Germany's ultimate destruction. As Antony Beevor meticulously details in *The Second World War*, the sheer vastness of Russia, the ferocity of Soviet resistance, and the brutal Russian winter proved to be insurmountable obstacles. Think about it. The Germans were accustomed to the short, decisive campaigns of the Blitzkrieg in Western Europe, but the Eastern Front was a different beast entirely. Logistical lines stretched to breaking point, supply convoys were constantly harassed, and the infrastructure was poor. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horses for transport, while effective in short bursts, was woefully inadequate for the scale of the Russian campaign. As the advance bogged down outside Moscow in late 1941, not only did the bitter cold take a brutal toll on troops ill-equipped for winter warfare, but the Soviets, having bought precious time, launched a powerful counter-offensive. This was the first major strategic setback, signaling that the war would not be a short one. The myth that was just the beginning. The next year saw Hitler, against the advice of many of his generals, divert significant forces towards the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad. This decision, often cited as one of Hitler's gravest strategic errors, led directly to the catastrophe of Stalingrad in 1942-43. The Sixth Army, under General Paulus, found itself encircled, starved, and frozen, with no hope of relief. The battle was a brutal, protracted struggle that became a symbol of Soviet tenacity and German overreach. As Beevor describes, the psychological impact of Stalingrad, both on the German and Soviet publics, was immense. For Germany, it was a devastating defeat, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and shattering the morale of the Wehrmacht. For the Soviets, it was a turning point, a clear signal that they could and would defeat the invaders. After Stalingrad, the war in the East became a grinding war of attrition, one that Germany simply could not win. The Soviets, despite their horrific losses, possessed greater manpower reserves and a rapidly mobilizing industrial base that began to outproduce Germany in key areas, especially tanks and artillery. The Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, was Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. Its failure marked the definitive end of German hopes for victory in the East. From then on, it was a slow, agonizing retreat back to Berlin. The Eastern Front became the primary meat grinder of the war, absorbing 80% of German military casualties. It was here, in the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Soviet Union, the answer to how Hitler loses. The war truly began to take shape. Beyond the snows of Russia, another fundamental reason how Hitler loses the war lay in the brittle economic foundations of the Third Reich. Adam Tooze, in his magisterial work *The Wages of Destruction*, provides an unparalleled look into the inner workings of Nazi Germany's war economy. Many popular narratives suggest Germany had a highly efficient, unstoppable war machine, but Tooze argues convincingly that this was largely a myth. Germany's economy, even after the conquests of Europe, was fundamentally fragile and unsustainable for a protracted global conflict. Germany entered the war with significant resource disadvantages compared to its major opponents. It lacked critical raw materials like oil, rubber, and many industrial metals. While the initial blitzkrieg campaigns were cheap in terms of resources, the invasion of the Soviet Union dramatically changed the equation. The Germans were forced to rely on synthetic oil production, a costly and energy-intensive process, and to plunder resources from occupied territories, which often came at the cost of local resistance and administrative headaches. The idea that Germany could sustain a war on multiple fronts against the combined industrial might of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union was, as Tooze demonstrates, a fantasy. Consider the scale. The United States alone, even before fully mobilizing, had an industrial capacity far exceeding Germany's. Britain, despite its smaller size, had a sophisticated industrial base and access to empire resources. The Soviet Union, while devastated initially, managed to relocate vast factories eastward and ramp up production. Germany, by contrast, struggled with bottlenecks, inefficient resource allocation, and a fragmented industrial policy. For much of the war, despite being engaged in total war, the German economy was not truly totalitarian in its production methods. Consumer goods production often continued at higher levels than one might expect, as the regime feared alienating the civilian population. It wasn't until Albert Speer took over as Minister of Armaments in 1942 that the serious attempt was made to rationalize and maximize war production. But by then, it was already too late. The gap with the Allies was widening, not shrinking. Furthermore, the Nazi regime's ideological obsessions often trumped economic rationality. The systematic genocide of European Jews, the brutal occupation policies, and the exploitation of slave labor were not just moral abominations, but also massive drains on resources and manpower that could have been directed toward the war effort. Millions of people who could have been productive members of society were instead exterminated or forced into exploitative labor under conditions that limited their output. The rail network, vital for moving troops and supplies to the front, was simultaneously used to transport millions to death camps, creating immense logistical strain. This diversion of resources, energy, and manpower into destructive, ideologically driven projects was a self-inflicted wound. It highlighted the inherent contradictions of a regime that prioritized racial purity and extermination over pragmatic strategic needs. The German war machine, for all its terrifying power, was built on an economic house of cards, constantly on the verge of collapse, making Germany's long-term defeat an economic inevitability. Hitler, a corporal in World War I, often saw himself as a military genius, overruling his more experienced generals. While this hubris sometimes led to daring, successful gambles in the early war, it ultimately proved disastrous when facing stronger, more coordinated opposition. As Richard Overy notes in *Why the Allies Won*, the Allies, despite their internal disagreements, generally pursued a more coherent and sustainable grand strategy. One of Hitler's most significant strategic errors was, of course, the invasion of the Soviet Union. By launching Operation Barbarossa, Germany effectively opened a second massive front, precisely the nightmare scenario that German strategists had tried to avoid since World War I. This decision divided Germany's military strength and resources, preventing the concentration of force needed to defeat either Britain or the Soviet Union decisively. Instead of focusing on knocking Britain out of the war, perhaps through a sustained bombing campaign, naval blockade, or even an invasion, Hitler turned east. He believed Britain was only fighting because it hoped for Soviet intervention. The Battle of Britain in 1940 had already shown that the Royal Air Force, despite being outnumbered, could deny Germany air superiority over the English Channel, making an invasion impossible. Britain, under Churchill, was prepared to fight alone if necessary, drawing upon its global empire and holding out hope for American entry into the war. Instead, it was very low that Hitler had overextended himself in the war, a concept that one of German military vetted and opponents before another cradle blood with the world united this November 1941, just as the Japanese Pearl Harbor. Japan, Germany's ally, had attacked the US, but Germany was not obligated by treaty to declare war. Hitler's decision, driven by ideological conviction and a misjudgment of American capabilities, formally brought the world's greatest industrial power into the European conflict. This effectively transformed a continental European war into a true global conflict. A war that Germany, with its limited resources, had no hope of winning against such a powerful coalition. The US entry guaranteed an overwhelming surge of industrial production and manpower that would eventually crush Germany and Japan. Finally, Hitler's refusal to allow strategic retreats or flexibility often led to the unnecessary destruction of entire armies, most famously at Stalingrad, but also repeatedly on the Eastern Front. His insistence on no step-back orders, while appealing to a certain ideological stubbornness, defied military logic and cost Germany irreplaceable men and equipment. These rigid command decisions, often made from far away without a full understanding of the ground situation, severely undermined the Wehrmacht's operational effectiveness. The cumulative effect of these strategic blunders, the two-front war, the declaration of war on the US, and tactical inflexibility, created an untenable situation that rapidly deteriorated, offering a powerful explanation for how Hitler loses the war. So far, we've focused heavily on Germany's self-inflicted wounds and inherent weaknesses. But to fully answer how Hitler loses the war, we must turn our attention to the immense, ultimately decisive power of the Allied coalition. The Grand Alliance of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States was a formidable force, overcoming ideological differences and national self-interest to present a united front against the Axis powers. As Richard Overy compellingly argues in *Why the Allies won*, it was the Allies' superior economic resources, technological innovation, and strategic cooperation that ultimately tipped the scales. Let's start with the Soviet Union. Despite suffering catastrophic initial losses, the Soviet people and leadership displayed an almost unbelievable resilience and capacity for sacrifice. Under Stalin, the Soviet industrial base was rapidly mobilized and relocated to the east, churning out tanks, aircraft, and artillery at astonishing rates, often surpassing German production even as their territory was being ravaged. The T-34 tank, the Katyusha rocket launcher, these became symbols of Soviet industrial might and effective, mass-produced weaponry. Though small in comparison to the US or USSR, Britain played a crucial role. It provided the strategic base from which the air war against Germany could be launched, and its navy maintained vital sea lanes, protecting convoys and preparing for future invasions. British scientific ingenuity, particularly in radar and code breaking at Bletchley Park, provided critical intelligence advantages. As Overy highlights, Britain's steadfast refusal to surrender, even when facing Germany alone, kept the flame of resistance alive and provided a crucial staging ground for the eventual liberation of Europe. And finally, the sleeping giant, the United States. Once fully mobilized, America's industrial capacity was simply staggering. It became the arsenal of democracy, supplying not only its own massive military, but also providing vast quantities of aid, food, fuel, raw materials, tanks, planes, and trucks to both Britain and the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. This material aid was absolutely vital, particularly for the Soviet war effort. The US also rapidly built up a two-ocean navy and an air force that would eventually rain destruction upon German cities and industrial targets. The ability of the US to project power across two vast oceans, simultaneously fighting in the Pacific and in Europe, showcased an unmatched industrial and logistical capability that Germany could never hope to match. This global logistical capability, a true testament to American enterprise and resources, is an often understated element of how Hitler loses the war. The cooperation between these diverse powers, despite their internal tensions, was key. Strategic bombing campaigns, coordinated naval operations, and the eventual synchronized land offensives on both the eastern and western fronts stretched German resources to breaking point. The combined industrial output, scientific innovation, and sheer manpower of the Allies were simply too overwhelming for Germany, particularly once they had overcome their initial setbacks. This grand alliance, fueled by an unstoppable industrial engine, was the ultimate undoing of the Third Reich. Our final major reason for how Hitler loses the war delves into the very nature of the Nazi regime itself. Far from being a perfectly efficient, monolithic state, Nazi Germany was riddled with internal contradictions, competing power centers, and an ideology that, while motivating, often worked against its own strategic interests. This inherent dysfunction, coupled with the escalating brutality, ultimately contributed to its downfall. As both Antony Beevor and Adam Tooze extensively document, the regime's structure and ideology fostered disunity and inefficiency. One significant aspect was the polycracy of the Nazi state. Instead of a clear chain of command, there were often overlapping responsibilities and competing factions vying for Hitler's favor: the Wehrmacht, the SS, the party chancellery, various ministries. This meant that rational decision-making was often hampered by internal rivalries and a desire to please Hitler rather than to achieve optimal strategic outcomes. Speer's attempts to streamline war production, for example, were often resisted by other party officials guarding their own fiefdoms. This wasn't a well-oiled machine. It was a collection of competing engines, all pulling in slightly different directions, often with Hitler acting as the ultimate unpredictable arbiter. Then there's the brutal and inherently self-destructive nature of Nazi ideology. The emphasis on racial purity and the systematic persecution and extermination of millions, particularly Jews, Slavs, and Roma, not only consumed vast resources, as we discussed earlier, but also alienated potential collaborators and fueled fierce resistance movements across occupied Europe. Instead of gaining willing partners, Germany created enemies in every occupied territory, forcing it to commit significant military resources to internal security and anti-partisan warfare, diverting them from the front lines. The cruelty of the regime also strengthened the resolve of the Allied powers, who increasingly viewed the war as a moral crusade against an undeniable evil. Furthermore, the leadership itself became increasingly detached from reality as the war progressed. Hitler, in particular, grew more isolated in his final years, relying on a dwindling circle of sycophants and often making decisions based on intuition or deeply flawed ideological beliefs rather than sound military intelligence. His paranoia, his contempt for his generals, and his refusal to acknowledge defeat led to catastrophic decisions that accelerated Germany's demise. The widespread use of drugs, including methamphetamine, by both troops and leadership, though perhaps exaggerated in some popular accounts, it was certainly a factor for many, including Hitler, may have also contributed to a certain detachment from the grim realities of the war. Finally, the growing disillusionment and despair within Germany itself, despite relentless propaganda, eventually took its toll. The unrelenting Allied bombing campaigns pulverized German cities, destroying infrastructure, industry, and civilian morale. The sheer scale of casualties, particularly on the Eastern Front, meant that almost every German family had lost loved ones. By 1944-45, even fanatical loyalty began to crack. The July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, though it failed, was a clear indication that not all Germans supported the regime, even within the military. These internal fragilities, the inherent flaws of the regime's structure, and the moral bankruptcy of its ideology created a system destined for collapse under the immense pressure of total war, solidifying the answer to how Hitler loses the war. We journey through the strategic blunders, the economic realities, the overwhelming power of the Allied coalition, and the internal contradictions of the Third Reich. It's clear that there wasn't a single silver bullet, no one moment that irrevocably decided how Hitler loses the war. Instead, it was a confluence of interconnected factors, a perfect storm of self-destruction, an overwhelming external force that brought Nazi Germany to its knees. Germany's economy, as Adam Tooze so eloquently details, was never truly capable of sustaining a protracted, multi-front global war against industrially superior powers. Hitler's strategic blunders, particularly the invasion of the Soviet Union and the declaration of war on the United States, transformed a continental conflict into a global one he could not win. And the Grand Alliance, as Richard Overy highlights, provided the industrial might, technological edge, and moral conviction to overcome the Axis threat. Finally, the very nature of the Nazi regime, its internal inefficiencies, its brutal ideology, and its detached leadership, ensured that even without external pressure, it was fundamentally unstable and self-destructive. Antony Beevor's comprehensive account reminds us of the immense human toll and the vast scale of this global catastrophe. So when we ask how Hitler loses the war, the answer is complex but undeniably clear. He lost because he overextended his military, underestimated his enemy's industrial and human potential, made catastrophic strategic errors, and waged war with an ideology that was not only morally reprehensible but also economically and politically self-defeating. The third was that in the middle of another world of the stroke, but better let us cue that had a world you had again the truth that I've given a new perspective on world road to put me favor. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I know it was a long one, but it's a story that deserves a thorough examination. I'm incredibly keen to hear your thoughts. What aspect of Germany's defeat do you find most compelling? Were there any specific insights from the historians we referenced today, Tooze, Overy, or Beevor, that particularly resonated with you? Or perhaps you have another crucial factor you think we should have explored further? Drop your comments and questions down below. I read as many as I can, and I love engaging in these historical discussions with you all. And before you go, don't forget to check out the description for links to the incredible books we discussed today, as well as other related videos that might deepen your understanding of this pivotal period in history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. This is Facts of War's channel, and I'll see you in the next video.